The gun barrel pressed against Eleanor's temple felt cold enough to freeze her blood, even in the sweltering heat of the Silver Spur Saloon on that June evening in 1876. Eleanor Hayes had arrived in Deadwood, Dakota Territory 3 weeks earlier with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a voice her mother swore could charm angels from heaven. She had fled St. Louis after her father's gambling debts landed him in prison and left their family destitute. Her mother had died the previous winter from consumption, and Eleanor's only remaining option was to head west, where no one knew her name or her shame. At 22 years old, she had taken a position as a singer at the Silver Spur, one of the many saloons that had sprung up like weeds after gold was discovered in the Black Hills. The establishment was owned by a portly man named Hiram Caldwell, who treated her decently enough, paying her $3 a week plus room and board in the small quarters above the saloon. Eleanor sang 4 nights a week, her clear soprano voice cutting through the cigarette smoke and whiskey fumes as miners and drifters forgot their troubles for a few precious hours. She kept to herself mostly, knowing that a woman alone in a town like Deadwood had to guard her reputation carefully, even while working in a saloon. Tonight had started like any other. She had performed 3 songs, accompanied by Chester Murphy on the upright piano that Hiram had hauled all the way from Cheyenne. The crowd had been appreciative, tossing coins onto the small stage and calling for more. Then, the Drayton gang had walked through the doors. Eleanor had heard whispers about them over the past week. Led by Cole Drayton, a vicious outlaw with a reputation for robbery and murder stretching from Missouri to Montana, the gang had been terrorizing settlements across the territory. They had robbed the bank in Spearfish just days ago, killing 2 men in the process. Law enforcement in these parts was sparse and often ineffective, and men like Drayton knew they could move with relative impunity through the wild, lawless expanses of the Dakota Territory. There were 5 of them. Cole Drayton himself was a lean man with pale eyes that seemed to look straight through a person. His second in command, a hulking brute named Jack Sutter, had a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. The others were younger, meaner versions of their leaders, all wearing the hard expressions of men who had long ago abandoned any pretense of decency. They had taken over the best table in the house, and Hiram had served them personally, his hands shaking as he poured their whiskey. The other patrons had grown quiet, many slipping out into the night rather than risk being caught up in whatever violence might erupt. Eleanor had tried to leave the stage, to disappear into her room upstairs, but Cole Drayton had stopped her with a single word: "Stay." His voice had been soft, almost gentle, which made it all the more terrifying. Eleanor had frozen on the stairs, her hand gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. "We want entertainment," Cole had continued, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a predator. "And you, darling, are going to provide it." "I have already finished my performance for the evening," Eleanor had managed to say, proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Cole had smiled then, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, we do not want you to sing. We want you to dance." The saloon had gone deathly silent. Eleanor understood immediately what he meant. He was not asking for a simple waltz or reel. He wanted her to perform like the dance hall girls in the more disreputable establishments, to degrade herself for their amusement. "I am a singer, not a dancer," she had said firmly. That was when Jack Sutter had moved with surprising speed, crossing the room and pressing his revolver to her head before she could even think to run. The cold metal against her temple had ended any thought of resistance. "The lady says she will dance," Jack had growled, his breath reeking of rot-gut whiskey and tobacco. Chester Murphy had remained frozen at the piano, his weathered hands hovering over the keys. Hiram stood behind the bar, his face ashen. The few remaining patrons pressed themselves against the walls, trying to become invisible. Eleanor's mind raced. She knew what happened to women who defied men like this. She had heard the stories, had seen the haunted looks in the eyes of women who had survived such encounters. But she also knew that compliance was no guarantee of safety. Men like Cole Drayton took what they wanted, regardless of whether their victims cooperated. "Play something lively, old man," Cole ordered Chester, who looked at Eleanor with anguished apology in his eyes. Chester's hands moved to the keys, and he began to play a jaunty tune that seemed obscene given the circumstances. Jack Sutter removed the gun from Eleanor's head and shoved her toward the center of the room. She stumbled, catching herself on a chair, and straightened her blue calico dress with trembling hands. "Dance," Cole commanded, settling back into his chair and propping his boots on the table. Eleanor stood frozen. She could not do this, would not do this. Her mother had raised her to be a lady, had taught her that dignity was the one thing no one could take from you unless you surrendered it, even in the depths of their poverty, even when they had been reduced to taking charity from neighbors. Her mother had held her head high. "I said dance," Cole repeated, and this time there was steel in his voice. One of the younger outlaws, a boy who could not have been more than 19, drew his pistol and fired a shot into the ceiling. Plaster rained down, and Eleanor flinched. Chester's playing faltered, then resumed. Eleanor closed her eyes, preparing herself for whatever would come. She would not dance. She would not give them this. If they killed her for it, at least she would die with her dignity intact. The door to the Silver Spur exploded inward. It did not open. It exploded, torn from its hinges by what seemed like the force of nature itself. A man filled the doorway, and for a moment Eleanor thought perhaps God had sent one of those angels her mother always spoke of. But angels did not look like this. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly brushed both sides of the doorframe. His hair, dark as a raven's wing, hung past his shoulders in wild waves that suggested he had not seen a barber in months. His face was deeply tanned and weathered, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of beard. But it was his eyes that held Eleanor transfixed. Even from across the room she could see they were the deep green of a mountain forest, and they blazed with a fury that made Cole Drayton's cruelty seem like a child's tantrum. He wore buckskin trousers and a leather vest over a homespun shirt that strained across a chest and arms thick with muscle. A massive hunting knife hung at his belt on one side, a Colt revolver on the other. He carried a Sharps rifle in his hands, the barrel still smoking. The piano playing stopped. "I said the piano was too damn loud," the stranger said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through Eleanor's chest. "Could hear it all the way down at the livery." Eleanor's gaze followed his, and she saw that a fresh bullet hole had appeared in the upright piano right through the center of the soundboard. The instrument let out a final discordant groan. The room had gone utterly, completely quiet. Cole Drayton was on his feet now, his hand hovering near his gun. His men had turned to face this new threat, but Eleanor could see the uncertainty in their postures. This was not what they had expected. "This is private business, friend," Cole said, his voice tight. "Best you move along." The stranger's gaze swept the room, taking in the scene in an instant. Eleanor, watching his eyes land on her, still standing in the center of the room where Jack Sutter had shoved her. She saw something flicker in those green depths, recognition of the situation, and a deepening of the anger already burning there. "Does not look like private business to me," the stranger said, taking a step into the saloon. "Looks like 5 men trying to terrorize a woman." 5 armed men, Jack Sutter pointed out, his scarred face twisted in a sneer. "Against 1 fool with a rifle. I do not like your odds." The stranger smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Funny, I was just thinking the same thing about yours." He moved then, with a speed that seemed impossible for a man of his size. The Sharps rifle swept up and fired, and Jack Sutter's gun went flying from his hand, along with 2 of his fingers. Jack screamed, clutching his maimed hand to his chest. Before the echo of the shot had faded, the stranger had dropped the rifle and drawn his Colt. 2 more shots rang out in rapid succession, and the guns of the younger outlaws went skittering across the floor. The stranger had not killed them, Eleanor realized. He had disarmed them with the kind of marksmanship that bordered on supernatural. Cole Drayton had managed to draw his weapon, but now he found himself staring down the barrel of the stranger's Colt, and whatever he saw in the bigger man's eyes made him freeze. "Drop it," the stranger said quietly. For a long moment, no one moved. Eleanor could hear Jack Sutter's ragged breathing, could smell the gun smoke that now filled the saloon. Then Cole Drayton slowly, carefully, bent and placed his pistol on the floor. "Smart man," the stranger said. He gestured toward the destroyed door with his gun. "Now get out, all of you, and if I see any of your faces in Deadwood again, I will not be so merciful." "You do not know who you are dealing with," Cole hissed. "I am Cole Drayton. I have 20 men who will hunt you to the ends of the earth for this." "Then they better start looking in the mountains," the stranger replied. "Because I am Tobias Kane, and I have been hunting men like you since before you drew your first cowardly breath. Now get out before I change my mind about letting you leave vertical." The name meant nothing to Eleanor, but she saw recognition in Cole's eyes, followed quickly by fear. Whatever reputation Tobias Kane carried, it was enough to make even a man like Cole Drayton reconsider his position. "This is not over," Cole said, but he was already backing toward the door, his men stumbling after him. Jack Sutter cradled his injured hand, leaving a trail of blood drops as he fled into the night. When they were gone, the silence in the saloon felt different, no longer oppressive but somehow sacred, as if everyone present recognized they had witnessed something significant. Tobias Kane holstered his pistol and turned to look at Eleanor fully for the first time. Their eyes met, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. He was the most intimidating man she had ever seen, all raw power and barely contained violence. But when he looked at her, his expression softened. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Eleanor shook her head, not trusting her voice. "Did they touch you?" "No," she managed. "You arrived in time." Something in his expression eased slightly. "Good." Hiram Caldwell seemed to suddenly remember how to move. He hurried out from behind the bar, wringing his hands. "Mr. Kane, I cannot thank you enough. Those men, they have been terrorizing the whole territory. The sheriff, he's afraid to stand up to them." "The sheriff is a coward," Tobias said flatly. He moved to pick up his Sharps rifle, checking it with practiced ease before slinging it over his shoulder. Someone needed to do something. "Let me buy you a drink," Hiram offered. "Food, too. Anything you want on the house?" Tobias glanced at Eleanor again. "I appreciate that. But first I think the lady could use some air. She looks like she might faint." Eleanor realized he was right. Her legs had begun to shake, the fear and adrenaline finally catching up with her now that the immediate danger had passed. She reached for the chair beside her, trying to steady herself. Tobias was there in an instant, his large hand gentle on her elbow. "Easy now. You are safe." The heat of his palm burned through the fabric of her sleeve, and Eleanor found herself looking up into his face. Up close, she could see the small scars that marked his skin, evidence of a hard life lived in harsh conditions. But his eyes were kind, despite the violence she had just witnessed him commit. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life." "Anyone with a conscience would have done the same," he replied, but his hand remained on her elbow, steadying her. "But no one else did," she pointed out. "Only you." Chester Murphy had left the ruined piano and now approached hesitantly. "Miss Eleanor, you should sit down. You have had a terrible shock." Tobias guided her to a chair, and she sank into it gratefully. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them in her lap to keep them still. The reality of what had almost happened crashed over her in waves, each one worse than the last. "Whiskey," Tobias said to Hiram, "and water. And get her something sweet if you have it. Sugar helps with shock." Hiram scurried to comply, and within moments Eleanor found a glass of water pressed into her hands. She drank it gratefully, then accepted the small piece of peppermint candy Hiram had produced from somewhere. The familiar sweetness grounded her, bringing her back to herself. Tobias had taken a seat across from her, giving her space but remaining close enough to help if needed. He accepted a glass of whiskey from Hiram but did not drink it immediately, instead watching Eleanor with a concerned expression. "What is your name?" he asked gently. "Eleanor Hayes." "You are the singer." It was not a question. "You heard me?" "I was down at the livery tending to my horse. Your voice carried." He paused. "It is beautiful." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Thank you. How long have you been in Deadwood?" 3 weeks, Tobias frowned. "And you have been working here alone? No family?" "I have no family left," Eleanor said, surprised at how easily the admission came. Something about this man invited honesty. "My mother died last winter. My father's in prison. I came west to start fresh." Understanding flickered in his eyes. He knew what it was like to be alone, she realized, knew what it meant to reinvent oneself in the raw, unforgiving landscape of the frontier. "Deadwood is not a safe place for a woman alone," he said. "I am learning that," Eleanor replied with a touch of bitterness. Tobias took a sip of his whiskey, his expression thoughtful. "Cole Drayton is a snake, but he is not stupid. He will not come back here, not after tonight. But he has a long memory, and he holds grudges. You should be careful." "I will be." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "But I will not live in fear. I have run far enough." Something like respect flickered in his eyes. "That is brave. Foolish, maybe, but brave." "What about you?" Eleanor asked. "Cole Drayton knew your name. He feared you. Who are you, Tobias Kane?" Tobias leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "I am no one important, just a man who lives in the mountains and prefers his own company." "A mountain man," Eleanor said softly. "That's what they call us." He smiled faintly. "I trap furs in winter, hunt for meat to sell in the mining camps in summer. I mind my own business and expect others to do the same." "But you came when I needed help." "I came because I could not sit by and listen to that racket any longer," he said, but his tone was teasing now, gentle. "And because no woman should have to endure what those men intended for you." Eleanor studied him, this large, dangerous man who had appeared like an avenging angel and then stayed to make sure she was all right. "Why did Cole Drayton fear you? What have you done?" Tobias was quiet for a long moment. "I have lived in these mountains for 10 years. Before that, I was a lawman in Kansas. I've dealt with men like Drayton before. I have a reputation for not backing down and for being a fair shot." He paused. "Also, I killed his brother 3 years ago. He tried to rob a stagecoach I was protecting. I gave him a chance to surrender. He did not take it." Eleanor should have been frightened by this revelation, but instead she felt oddly reassured. Tobias Kane was a man who defended the innocent and punished the guilty. In a lawless land, that made him more valuable than gold. "Will he come after you for revenge?" she asked. "Probably. Eventually. But Cole is a coward at heart. He will not try anything unless he has overwhelming force on his side." Tobias finished his whiskey and set the glass down. "Which is why I think you should consider leaving Deadwood. Go to Cheyenne or Denver, somewhere with actual law enforcement." "I cannot," Eleanor said firmly. "I have no money for travel, and I barely have enough to survive as it is. Besides, I will not be driven away by fear." Tobias looked at her for a long moment, and Eleanor felt as if he were seeing past her words to the determination beneath. "You are stubborn. I prefer to think of it as resilient." A real smile crossed his face then, transforming his features from merely handsome to breathtaking. "Fair enough." Hiram had been hovering nearby, and now he approached with a plate of food. "Mr. Kane, please eat. And Miss Eleanor, you should have something too. It will help settle your nerves." Eleanor realized she was hungry, despite everything. She accepted a plate of bread and cheese, eating slowly while Tobias worked his way through a substantial meal of roasted meat and potatoes. They did not speak while they ate, but the silence was comfortable, companionable. Other patrons had begun to cautiously return to the saloon, drawn by curiosity about the stranger who had faced down the Drayton gang. They gave Tobias respectful nods, and he acknowledged them with brief courtesy, but did not invite conversation. Eleanor noticed how people looked at him with awe, with fear, with gratitude. He was clearly uncomfortable with the attention. When they had finished eating, Tobias stood. "I should go. I have a camp about 5 miles north of here, and I need to check on my horse." Eleanor felt a sudden desperate urge to ask him to stay. The thought of him disappearing into the wilderness, of never seeing him again, sent a pang through her chest that surprised her with its intensity. But she had no right to ask him to remain. He had already done more than enough. "Thank you again," she said, standing as well. "I owe you my life." "You owe me nothing." He paused, then added, "But I would feel better if you stayed cautious. Keep your door locked at night. Do not go anywhere alone after dark." "I will." Tobias nodded, then turned to leave. He had almost reached the doorway when Eleanor found herself calling out to him. "Will you come back?" He stopped and looked back at her. "Do you want me to?" Eleanor knew she should say no. Should tell him that she could take care of herself, that she did not need a protector, but the words that came out were different. "Yes, I would like that." Something warm flickered in his eyes. "Then I will come back, tomorrow evening, if you are singing." "I will be singing." "Good." He touched 2 fingers to his forehead in a casual salute, then stepped out into the night, ducking slightly to clear the damaged door frame. Eleanor watched him go, her heart beating faster than it had any right to. She barely knew this man, had spoken to him for less than an hour, but something had passed between them in that saloon, something that felt like recognition, like coming home. Chester approached her, his expression knowing. "That's a good man, Miss Eleanor. Hard, but good. The kind you want on your side in this country." "He is certainly impressive," Eleanor agreed, trying to keep her voice neutral. Chester chuckled. "Impressive, that's one word for it." He looked at the destroyed piano and sighed. "Well, I suppose I will need to tell Hiram he needs a new piano. That one will never play again." Eleanor felt a surge of guilt. "I'm sorry, Chester. This is all my fault." "Nonsense," the old man said firmly. "This is the fault of those outlaws and no one else. You are a victim here, not the cause." He patted her hand. "Get some rest, child. You have had a trying evening." Eleanor made her way upstairs to her small room, her legs still unsteady. Once inside, she locked the door, as Tobias had advised, then sank onto her narrow bed. Her hands had finally stopped shaking, but her mind was racing. She kept seeing Tobias Kane's face, kept hearing his deep voice telling her she was safe. No one had made her feel safe since her mother died. She had been adrift, alone, fighting to survive in a world that seemed determined to grind her down. But for a few moments tonight, with Tobias's hand on her elbow and his eyes watching over her, she had felt protected. It was dangerous to feel this way. She barely knew him. He was a mountain man, a loner who lived miles from civilization. Their worlds could not be more different. She was trying to build a life in town, to establish herself as a respectable woman, despite working in a saloon. He belonged to the wilderness, as wild and untamed as the land itself. But her heart did not care about logic or practicality. Her heart had already decided. Eleanor lay back on her bed, staring at the rough wooden ceiling. Tomorrow evening seemed impossibly far away. She wondered if he would actually return, or if the harsh light of day would make him reconsider. Perhaps he would decide she was too much trouble, too much of a complication in his solitary life. But no. When Tobias Kane made a promise, Eleanor sensed he kept it. He would come back, and she would be waiting. Outside her window, the sounds of deadwood continued. Laughter and shouts, the jangle of piano music from other saloons, the occasional gunshot. But Eleanor barely heard any of it. Her mind was filled with green eyes and broad shoulders, and a voice that made her feel safe for the first time in longer than she could remember. Tomorrow could not come fast enough. Eleanor woke the next morning to bright sunlight streaming through her window and the sound of hammering from below. She dressed quickly in a simple brown skirt and white blouse, then made her way downstairs to find Hiram supervising two men as they worked to repair the damaged door. "Good morning, Miss Eleanor," Hiram greeted her cheerfully. "I trust you slept well?" "As well as could be expected," Eleanor replied. In truth, she had tossed and turned for hours before finally falling into a restless sleep filled with fragmented dreams. I have been thinking," Hiram said, steering her toward the bar where he had laid out a simple breakfast of bread and jam. "About last night. About your safety. I'm installing a proper lock on your door upstairs, and I'm hiring a man to watch the saloon at night, someone who can handle trouble if it arises." Eleanor felt touched by his concern. "That's very kind of you, Hiram, but you do not need to go to such expense." "Yes, I do," Hiram said firmly. "You are under my protection while you work here, and I failed you last night. If Mr. Kane had not arrived when he did—" He shook his head, not finishing the thought. "It will not happen again." Eleanor squeezed his hand gratefully. "Thank you." She spent the morning helping to clean the saloon, trying to keep herself busy so she would not constantly think about Tobias. It did not work. Every time the door opened, her heart leapt, hoping to see his broad shoulders filling the doorway. But it was always someone else. Miners coming in for lunch, merchants conducting business, women purchasing supplies. Chester arrived in the afternoon to assess the damage to his piano. He ran his hands over the bullet hole, shaking his head sadly. "She is beyond saving, I'm afraid. The bullet went straight through the soundboard. Even if we could repair it, she would never sound the same." "What will we do?" Eleanor asked. "I cannot sing without accompaniment." "Hiram is already making arrangements to have a new piano brought in from Cheyenne," Chester assured her. "But it will take several weeks. In the meantime, perhaps you could sing without accompaniment. Your voice is strong enough to carry on its own." The thought made Eleanor nervous, but she agreed. She'd come too far to let this setback stop her. As evening approached, Eleanor changed into her best dress, a deep blue silk that had belonged to her mother. She fixed her honey blonde hair, pinning it up carefully and leaving a few curls to frame her face. She told herself she was not dressing up for Tobias Kane, but her reflection in the mirror told a different story. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with anticipation. The saloon filled quickly as word spread about the previous night's events. Everyone wanted to see the woman who had nearly been forced to dance for the Drayton gang and the hero who had saved her. Eleanor felt their eyes on her as she took the small stage, but she held her head high. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "As you may have noticed, our piano is temporarily out of commission, so tonight I will be singing without accompaniment. I hope you will bear with me." She launched into a ballad her mother had loved, a sad song about a woman waiting for her lover to return from the sea. Her voice rang out pure and true, and the rowdy crowd fell silent, listening with rapt attention. Eleanor lost herself in the music, forgetting her nervousness, forgetting everything except the melody and the words. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous. Eleanor smiled and curtsied, then began another song. She was halfway through when she saw him. Tobias Kane stood near the back of the room, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He had clearly made an effort to clean up his hair, was damp and tied back with a leather cord, and he wore a clean shirt under his leather vest. But nothing could tame the wildness in him, the sense that he belonged more to the mountains than to civilization. Their eyes met, and Eleanor felt her breath catch. She nearly faltered in her singing, but forced herself to continue, pouring all of the emotion she felt into the melody. She sang directly to him, as if they were the only two people in the room. When the song ended, Tobias smiled at her, and Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest. She performed 3 more songs, then took a break to rest her voice. The crowd was generous with their applause and their coins, and Hiram looked pleased with the evening's success. Eleanor made her way through the crowd, accepting compliments and thanks, but her attention was focused on the back of the room where Tobias waited. He met her halfway, and somehow it felt perfectly natural when he took her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, his fingers strong and warm. "That was beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you for coming back," Eleanor replied. "I said I would." He glanced around at the crowded saloon. "Is there somewhere quieter we could talk?" Eleanor hesitated. Propriety dictated that she should not go anywhere alone with a man she barely knew, but propriety also dictated that respectable women did not work in saloons, and Eleanor had already crossed that line. Besides, every instinct she possessed told her that she could trust Tobias Kane. "There is a small porch out back," she said. "We could sit there." Tobias nodded and followed her through the saloon. Eleanor was acutely aware of the curious glances they received, of the whispers that followed in their wake. Let them talk, she thought defiantly. She had done nothing wrong. The back porch was small and somewhat rickety, but it offered privacy and a view of the mountains rising in the distance. The evening air was cool and fresh after the smoky atmosphere of the saloon. Eleanor took a seat on the wooden bench, and Tobias settled beside her, his large frame making the bench seem tiny. "How was your day?" Eleanor asked, then immediately felt foolish. What a mundane question to ask this extraordinary man. But Tobias did not seem to mind. "Productive? I sold some furs to the trading post, bought supplies, checked on my traps. Nothing exciting." "And your camp? Is it comfortable?" "Comfortable enough. I have a cabin about 5 miles north, up in the hills. Nothing fancy, but it keeps out the rain and the cold." He paused. "What about you? How are you feeling after last night?" "Better," Eleanor admitted, "though I keep replaying it in my mind. What might have happened if you had not arrived?" "Do not torture yourself with that," Tobias said firmly. "You are safe. That is what matters." "Because of you," Eleanor turned to look at him directly. "I want you to understand how grateful I am. You risked your life for a stranger." "You're not a stranger anymore," Tobias said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Eleanor's heart began to race. "No," she agreed softly. "I suppose I am not." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of the town. Then Tobias spoke again. "Tell me about yourself, Eleanor Hayes. Where did you come from? What brought you to Deadwood?" So Eleanor told him. She found herself sharing things she had told no one else about her father's weakness for gambling, about watching her mother waste away from consumption, about the desperate poverty that had forced her west. She told him about her dreams of building a new life, of perhaps one day opening a small music school where she could teach children to sing. Tobias listened without interrupting, his attention never wavering. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You have been through a lot," he finally said, "but you are still here, still fighting. That takes strength." "Sometimes I do not feel strong," Eleanor confessed. "Sometimes I feel like I'm barely holding on." "That is what strength is," Tobias said. "Not feeling invincible, but continuing anyway, even when you are afraid." Eleanor looked at him with new appreciation. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone more rough, uncivilized. But you speak well. You are thoughtful. How did you end up living alone in the mountains?" It was Tobias's turn to be silent. Eleanor watched emotions play across his face, pain, regret, sorrow. Finally he spoke. "I was married once. Her name was Sarah. We met in Kansas when I was working as a deputy marshal. She was the daughter of a shopkeeper, sweet and gentle. We married when I was 24 and she was 22. We were happy." Eleanor heard the past tense and braced herself. "I was tracking a group of outlaws who had robbed a bank. I was gone for 3 weeks. When I came back..." His voice roughened. "They had come through town while I was away. They burned half the buildings, killed several people. Sarah was one of them. She had been in the wrong place at the wrong time." "Oh, Tobias," Eleanor breathed. "I'm so sorry." "I tracked those men down," Tobias continued, his voice flat now, emotionless. "It took me 6 months, but I found every last one of them. I brought them to justice." He paused. "But it did not bring Sarah back. Nothing could do that." "So you came to the mountains." "I could not stay in Kansas. Everything reminded me of her, and I could not be a lawman anymore. Could not put on that badge knowing it had cost me the person I loved most, so I came west and started over. That was 10 years ago." Eleanor reached out and placed her hand over his. "You have carried this pain alone for too long." Tobias looked down at their joined hands. "It is easier that way. Alone, no one can be hurt because of me. Alone, I do not have to risk losing someone again." "But that is not living," Eleanor said softly. "That is just existing." Tobias met her eyes, and Eleanor saw the war raging within him, the desire to protect himself from further pain, but also the longing for connection, for something more than solitary survival. "I know," he said quietly, "but it is the only way I know how to be anymore." Eleanor understood then that Tobias Kane was as lost as she was. They had both been shaped by tragedy, had both built walls around their hearts to keep out further pain. But sitting here in the gathering darkness with his hand warm beneath hers, Eleanor felt those walls beginning to crumble. "Perhaps we could try something different," she suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps we could try not being alone. Together." Tobias searched her face, and Eleanor held her breath, waiting for his response. Finally, slowly, he turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. "Perhaps we could," he agreed. They sat together on that small porch as the stars began to appear overhead, two broken people reaching for each other across the distance of their pain. Eleanor did not know what the future held, did not know if this fragile connection between them could survive the harsh realities of frontier life. But for the first time since her mother's death, she felt hope stirring in her chest. Hope and something else, something warmer, deeper, more dangerous. She was falling in love with Tobias Kane. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Over the following weeks, Tobias became a regular fixture at the Silver Spur. He would arrive each evening just as Eleanor began her performance, taking his usual spot at the back of the room. After she finished singing, they would steal away to the back porch or take short walks through town, carefully staying in well-lit public areas. They talked about everything and nothing. Tobias told her stories of his life in the mountains, encounters with bears and mountain lions, harsh winters spent snowed in, the profound silence of the wilderness. Eleanor shared her memories of St. Louis, of music lessons and church socials, of a life that seemed impossibly far away now. The new piano arrived from Cheyenne, and Chester was overjoyed. Eleanor returned to performing with accompaniment, though she had discovered she enjoyed the challenge of singing alone. Her confidence had grown, and with it, her reputation. Men traveled from other camps and towns to hear her sing, and Hiram had to hire additional staff to manage the crowds. Eleanor saved every penny she could, tucking the money into a small tin under her bed. She was not sure what she was saving for passage to a bigger city, perhaps, or the capital to start her music school. But having that nest egg gave her a sense of security she had not felt in years. Tobias, meanwhile, continued his solitary life in the mountains, but Eleanor could see the change in him. He smiled more readily now, laughed at her jokes, seemed more present in the moment rather than lost in painful memories. She knew he still grieved, for Sarah would probably always grieve for her, but he was learning to live again, not just survive. One evening in late July, nearly 6 weeks after they had met, Tobias arrived at the saloon earlier than usual. Eleanor was still preparing for her performance, but she came down when Hiram told her Tobias was asking for her. She found him pacing near the door, his expression troubled. "What is wrong?" she asked immediately. "I need to talk to you, privately." Eleanor led him to the back porch, her heart pounding. Had something happened? Was he leaving? Once they were alone, Tobias turned to face her. "I heard something in town today, from a trapper coming down from Montana. He said the Drayton gang has been seen in the area again. They are camped about 30 miles north." Eleanor felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "Do you think they are coming back here?" "I think it is possible. Cole Drayton is not the type to forget, and he's had time to lick his wounds and gather reinforcements." Tobias ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I do not like it, Eleanor. I do not like you being here, vulnerable." "What are you suggesting?" "Come stay at my cabin, just for a while, until the threat passes. You would be safe there. The location is remote, hard to find unless you know what you are looking for." Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. Living alone with Tobias in his cabin, unmarried and unchaperoned, would destroy what remained of her reputation. But her reputation was already precarious. And what good was respectability if she was dead? "For how long?" she asked. "A few weeks, maybe longer. I know it is a lot to ask, but—" "I will come." Tobias looked startled. "You will?" "I trust you," Eleanor said simply. "And I would rather be alive and scandalous than dead and respectable." Relief flooded his face. "Pack what you need tonight. I will come for you before dawn tomorrow. We should leave before the town wakes up. Less chance of anyone seeing us, asking questions." Eleanor nodded. "I will need to tell Hiram. He deserves to know why I'm leaving." "Agreed. But no one else. The fewer people who know where you are, the safer you will be." They made their plans quickly. Eleanor would tell Hiram she was visiting a sick friend in Rapid City and would be gone for several weeks. It was a thin excuse, but better than nothing. Tobias would provide the supplies they would need, and Eleanor would pack her clothing and personal belongings. That night, Eleanor could barely sleep. She packed her carpet bag with her modest wardrobe, her mother's Bible, and the tin containing her savings. She wrote a brief note to Hiram, sticking to their agreed-upon story, and left it on her bed where he would find it. Just before dawn, a soft knock came at her door. Eleanor opened it to find Tobias standing there, his expression serious in the dim light. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "Ready?" They slipped out of the saloon like thieves, moving through the still dark streets of Deadwood. Tobias had 2 horses waiting at the livery, his own large stallion and a smaller mare. He helped Eleanor mount, then swung up onto his own horse with practiced ease. They rode north as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Eleanor looked back once at Deadwood, wondering if she would ever return. Then she turned her attention forward, toward the mountains and the unknown future that awaited her there. The journey took most of the day. They followed no road, instead picking their way through rough terrain that required all of Eleanor's concentration to navigate. Tobias led the way with confidence, clearly knowing every rock and tree of this landscape. They stopped once to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch of jerky and hardtack. Eleanor's back and legs ached from the unaccustomed riding, but she did not complain. This was her choice, and she would see it through. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew cooler and thinner. Eleanor found herself breathing harder, her lungs working to adjust to the altitude. The landscape was breathtakingly beautiful, dense forests of pine and aspen, rocky outcroppings that offered sweeping views of the valleys below. crystal-clear streams that bubbled over smooth stones. "It is magnificent," Eleanor said during one rest stop, gazing out at the vista before them. It is home," Tobias replied simply. "The only place I have felt at peace since Sarah died." They reached the cabin in late afternoon. It was larger than Eleanor had expected, built solidly of logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. The location was perfect, nestled in a small valley with forest on 3 sides and a clear view of the approach from the south. A creek ran nearby, providing fresh water. Tobias dismounted and came to help Eleanor down from her horse. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground, and he caught her easily, his strong hands steadying her. "Sorry," she gasped. "I'm not used to riding." "You did well. Many people could not have made that journey." He kept one hand on her elbow as he led her toward the cabin. "Come on, let me show you your new home. Temporary home," he corrected quickly. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly comfortable. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and chairs, and shelves filled with supplies. A ladder led to a small loft where Tobias clearly slept. Another door opened onto a smaller room that appeared to serve as storage. "You can have the loft," Tobias said, following her gaze. "I will sleep down here." "I cannot take your bed," Eleanor protested. "You can and you will. It is more private up there and warmer in winter. Not that we will be here in winter," he added quickly. "This is just temporary." Eleanor was too tired to argue. She climbed the ladder to the loft and found a comfortable bed made up with thick furs and wool blankets. It was clear Tobias had prepared this space for her before coming to fetch her. She came back down to find him building up the fire. "I will make dinner," he said. "Nothing fancy, I'm afraid. Just stew." "I can help," Eleanor offered. "You should rest. You've had a long day." But Eleanor insisted on helping, and soon they were working together in the small cabin. Tobias proved to be a competent cook, and Eleanor contributed what knowledge she had. They fell into an easy rhythm, moving around each other in the confined space with surprising grace. As they ate dinner at the rough table, Eleanor realized she felt more at home here than she had anywhere since her mother's death. There was something deeply satisfying about this simple existence, the warmth of the fire, the good food, the company of someone she cared about. "Thank you for this," she said, "for protecting me. Again." "You do not need to keep thanking me," Tobias replied. "I want you safe. That is enough." Eleanor met his eyes across the table. "Why? Why do you care so much about what happens to me?" Tobias was quiet for a long moment. "I think you know why." Eleanor's heart began to race. I would like to hear you say it." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Because in the past 6 weeks, you have become important to me, more important than I thought anyone could be again. When I think about something happening to you, about those outlaws hurting you," his jaw clenched. "I cannot let that happen. I will not." "Tobias," Eleanor whispered. She stood and moved around the table to where he sat. "I feel the same way. About you." He looked up at her, his green eyes intense in the firelight. "Eleanor, you need to understand something. I'm not an easy man to care about. I have too much darkness in me, too many ghosts. I live out here because I do not fit in civilization anymore. If you tie yourself to me, you are choosing a hard life." "I am not afraid of hard," Eleanor said. "I have been through hard. What I'm afraid of is spending the rest of my life alone, never taking a chance on something real." She reached out and cupped his face in her hands. "You are real, Tobias Kane. You are the realest thing I have found in this wilderness." Tobias stood, and suddenly he was so close, Eleanor could feel the heat radiating from his body. His hands came up to rest on her waist, and she felt small and protected in his grasp. "If we do this," he said quietly, "if we start down this path, there is no going back. I am not a man who does things halfway." "Neither am I," Eleanor replied. Tobias bent his head slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but Eleanor did not want to pull away. She rose on her toes to meet him halfway, and when their lips finally touched, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them learning the shape and taste of each other. Then it deepened, and Eleanor felt heat bloom through her entire body. Tobias's arms came fully around her, pulling her close, and she clung to him, lost in sensation. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Tobias rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I have not kissed anyone since Sarah," he confessed. "I have never kissed anyone at all," Eleanor admitted. "Until now." His eyes opened and she saw wonder in them. "Never. Never. I was waiting for it to mean something," she smiled. "I'm glad I waited." Tobias kissed her again, more confidently this time, and Eleanor felt herself melting into him. She had read about passion in books, had heard other women whisper about it, but she had never understood until this moment. This was what all the songs were about, what poets tried to capture in words, this feeling of complete rightness, of two souls recognizing each other. When they finally separated, Tobias stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow we can start settling you in properly." Eleanor understood what he was not saying. They had crossed a line tonight, had acknowledged the feelings between them. But he was too much of a gentleman to push for more, and she appreciated his restraint. "Good night, Tobias," she said softly. "Good night, Eleanor." She climbed to the loft and settled into the comfortable bed, her mind whirling. Everything had changed so fast. Just this morning she had been in Deadwood, living her carefully constructed life. Now she was in a cabin in the mountains, having just been kissed by a man she was falling in love with. Below, she could hear Tobias banking the fire, preparing his own makeshift bed. Eleanor smiled into the darkness. Whatever came next, whatever challenges they would face, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The days that followed fell into a comfortable pattern. Eleanor and Tobias rose with the sun, sharing breakfast before Tobias went about his daily tasks, checking his trap lines, hunting for meat, chopping wood. Eleanor kept the cabin tidy, prepared meals, and washed their clothes in the creek. It was hard, physical work, so different from singing in a saloon, but Eleanor found she enjoyed it. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sunset behind the mountains. Tobias taught her to identify different bird calls, showed her which plants were edible and which were poisonous. Eleanor sang for him sometimes, her voice carrying through the quiet forest. They talked endlessly, sharing stories from their pasts, discussing their hopes for the future. Tobias spoke more about Sarah, and Eleanor was glad. She did not want him to bury his grief. Sarah had been important to him, had shaped who he was. Eleanor could honor that. They kissed often, stolen moments of tenderness that left them both breathless and wanting more. But Tobias was always careful not to push too far. He was protecting her reputation, Eleanor knew, even though they were alone in the wilderness. It was old-fashioned and sweet, and made her love him even more. Because she did love him. Eleanor admitted it to herself one night as she lay in the loft, listening to Tobias's quiet breathing below. She loved his strength and his gentleness, his fierce protectiveness, and his surprising vulnerability. She loved the way he looked at her like she was precious, the way he listened when she spoke as if her words were the most important thing in the world. 2 weeks passed in their mountain sanctuary. Then 3. Eleanor began to wonder if they would ever return to civilization, and found she did not care much either way. She was happy here, happier than she had ever been. Then one morning, Tobias came back from checking his traps with a troubled expression. "What is wrong?" Eleanor asked immediately. "I found tracks, multiple horses heading up the mountain from the south. They are maybe a day old, but they were definitely searching for something. Or someone." Eleanor felt fear clutch at her heart. The Drayton gang? Possibly, or maybe just hunters passing through. But I do not want to take chances. He moved to the wall where his weapons hung and began checking them methodically. "I'm going to scout the area, see if I can figure out who they are and what they want. I need you to stay here. Keep the door barred. If anyone comes who is not me, you hide in the cellar." Eleanor had not known there was a cellar. Tobias showed her the hidden trapdoor in the corner of the cabin, revealing a small underground space stocked with emergency supplies. "I will be back before nightfall," he promised. "But if I am not, if something goes wrong, you wait 2 days. Then you take the mare and you ride hard for Rapid City. Do not go back to Deadwood. Find the marshal there. Tell him what happened. He is a good man. He will help you." "Nothing is going to go wrong," Eleanor said firmly, trying to convince herself as much as him. "You are being cautious, that is all." Tobias pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I hope you are right, but I need you to promise me you will do what I said. If I do not come back, you run. Promise me, Eleanor." "I promise," she whispered against his chest. He tilted her face up and kissed her deeply, pouring everything he felt into that kiss. When he pulled back, his eyes were fierce. I'm coming back to you. Whatever happens out there, I'm coming back. I know. But Eleanor's heart was heavy with fear as she watched him ride away. She did as he had instructed, barring the door and keeping his spare rifle close at hand. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. Sunset came and went, night fell, and still Tobias had not returned. Eleanor tried to tell herself that he had just been delayed, that tracking took time. But as the hours dragged on, her fear grew. She paced the cabin like a caged animal, unable to settle, unable to think of anything except Tobias out there in the darkness. It was well after midnight when she finally heard the sound of a horse approaching. Eleanor grabbed the rifle and positioned herself by the door, her heart pounding. Eleanor. Tobias's voice, strained and tight with pain. It is me. Let me in. She threw open the door and nearly dropped the rifle. Tobias was slumped in his saddle, his shirt dark with blood. He managed to dismount but staggered immediately, and Eleanor rushed to support him. What happened? She demanded, helping him into the cabin. Found them. 5 men, not the Drayton gang, just drifters. But they had been talking to someone in Deadwood, someone who told them there might be a woman hiding in the mountains with a reward on her head. He winced as Eleanor helped him to a chair. They are not a problem anymore. You are hurt. Gunshot wound. It went through clean, missed anything vital. But I lost some blood. Eleanor's medical knowledge was limited, but she had helped her mother tend to injuries in their neighborhood. She moved with swift efficiency, heating water, gathering clean cloth. Tobias had supplies for this kind of emergency, and she used them to clean and bind his wound. He had been shot in his left shoulder, and as he had said, the bullet had gone straight through. Eleanor cleaned the entry and exit wounds as gently as she could, but she knew it hurt terribly. Tobias never made a sound, just sat stoically while she worked. You need to rest, she said when she had finished bandaging him, and you should not have ridden all the way back here with a wound like this. You could have bled to death. I needed to get back to you, Tobias said simply. Needed to make sure you were safe. I was safe. You made sure of that before you left. Eleanor helped him to his feet. Come on, you were sleeping in the loft tonight where I can keep an eye on you. Eleanor, I cannot. Yes, you can. I am not debating this, Tobias Kane. You are injured, and I'm going to take care of you. He was too weak to argue. Eleanor helped him climb the ladder, a slow and painful process, then got him settled on the bed. She brought up water and made him drink, then sat beside him as his eyes began to close. Stay with me, he mumbled, his hand finding hers. Please. I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor promised. She lay down beside him on top of the blankets, fully clothed, and held his hand while he slept. His forehead was hot to the touch, and Eleanor prayed that infection would not set in. But the wound had been clean, and she had done her best. Now it was up to Tobias's strength and God's mercy. The next few days were difficult. Tobias developed a fever, and Eleanor tended to him constantly, bathing his forehead with cool water, forcing him to drink, checking his wound for signs of infection. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes delirious. In his delirium, he called for Sarah. Eleanor held his hand and soothed him, feeling no jealousy. Sarah had been his wife, had loved him. It was natural that his mind would turn to her in his suffering, but he called for Eleanor too. Do not leave, he would murmur. Stay. Need you here. I am here, she would whisper back. I am not leaving you. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Tobias woke with clear eyes, weak but rational. He found Eleanor asleep in a chair beside the bed, her hand still holding his, and he squeezed it gently. Eleanor, she woke immediately. You're back. I'm back. He tried to sit up and grimaced. How long have I been out? 3 days. You had a fever. I was so worried. Tears suddenly spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. I thought I was going to lose you. Hey! Tobias reached up with his good arm and pulled her onto the bed beside him. I'm fine. You took good care of me. You should not have gone after those men alone, Eleanor said, anger mixing with her relief. You could have been killed. But I was not. And now they cannot hurt you. That is what matters. Eleanor wanted to argue, but she was too exhausted and too relieved to have him back. She rested her head carefully on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt some of the tension leave her body. "I love you," she said quietly. She had not meant to say it, had not planned this moment, but the words came out anyway, simple and true. She felt Tobias go still beneath her. Then his arm tightened around her. "Say that again." Eleanor lifted her head to look at him. "I love you, Tobias Kane. I know it is too soon. I know we have only known each other for a couple of months. But I cannot help how I feel. I love you." The expression on his face was one of wonder, mixed with something like pain. "I did not think I would ever hear those words again. Did not think I would ever feel this way again." "And how do you feel?" "Like I have been given a second chance I do not deserve." He cupped her face in his hand. "I love you too, Eleanor. God help me. I love you so much it terrifies me." Eleanor kissed him gently, mindful of his injury. "You do not need to be terrified. We are in this together." "Together," Tobias repeated, as if testing the word. "I like the sound of that." They lay together in the loft, speaking in quiet voices about the future they might build together. Tobias spoke hesitantly at first, as if afraid to hope, but gradually grew more confident. He talked about expanding the cabin, maybe building a small barn for the horses. Eleanor talked about creating a garden, teaching Tobias to read music, eventually returning to Deadwood so she could sing again. "I want to marry you," Tobias said suddenly, "properly, with a preacher and witnesses and everything legal." Eleanor's heart soared. "Is that a proposal?" "It is a terrible proposal. I do not even have a ring to offer you." He smiled ruefully. "But yes. Eleanor Hayes, will you marry me?" "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They sealed their engagement with a kiss, and Eleanor felt joy bubble up inside her. She had come to the Dakota Territory with nothing, running from poverty and despair. Now she had found a home, a purpose, and a man who loved her. Tobias recovered slowly over the next 2 weeks. His strength returned gradually, and Eleanor made sure he did not overdo it. She took over more of the physical tasks around the cabin, discovering she was stronger than she had realized. The work was satisfying in a way singing had never been, though she missed performing. "When can we go back to Deadwood?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Soon, another week or two to make sure I am fully healed, and to make certain that the threat from the Drayton gang has really passed." Tobias took her hand. "Why? Are you eager to get back?" "I miss singing," Eleanor admitted, "and I want people to know we are engaged. I want to shout it from the rooftops." Tobias laughed, a sound that still felt precious because it was so rare. "We will tell everyone, but first we should probably get married. I do not want there to be any question about your reputation." "My reputation is already questionable," Eleanor pointed out. "I have been living alone with you for over a month. Which is why we need to make this official as soon as possible. There is a preacher in Rapid City. We could go there, get married, then return to Deadwood as husband and wife." The plan was sound, and Eleanor agreed readily. They spent the next week preparing for their journey, packing what they would need, planning their route. Tobias's shoulder was healing well, though he admitted it still ached, especially when the weather changed. Finally, on a clear morning in late August, they set out. This time, the journey felt different. Eleanor was no longer running from danger, but moving toward a future. She rode beside Tobias with confidence, no longer the city girl who had struggled with the rough terrain. The mountains had changed her, made her stronger. They reached Rapid City in 2 days. It was a larger town than Deadwood, with actual streets and several substantial buildings. Tobias led them directly to the home of Reverend Thomas Blackwell, a Methodist minister he knew from his lawman days. The Reverend was delighted to see Tobias and immediately agreed to perform the wedding ceremony. "I had heard you had become a hermit in the mountains," he said with a smile. "I am glad to see that is no longer the case." "I have Eleanor to thank for that," Tobias replied, pulling her close. They were married that very evening in the Reverend's small church, with the Reverend's wife serving as witness. Eleanor wore her best dress, and Tobias had found a clean shirt and vest. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Eleanor felt tears of joy stream down her face. "You may kiss your bride," the Reverend said with a smile. Tobias did not need to be told twice. He pulled Eleanor into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, and she kissed him back with all the love in her heart. They spent their wedding night at a small hotel, and for the first time, they truly became husband and wife in every sense. Tobias was gentle with Eleanor, patient with her inexperience, and she discovered that the poets had been right after all. There was magic in the union of two people who truly loved each other. The next morning, they began the journey back to Deadwood. Eleanor wore the simple gold band Tobias had purchased from a jeweler in Rapid City, and she kept looking down at it, marveling at the symbol of their commitment. They arrived in Deadwood in the afternoon to find the town buzzing with news. The Drayton gang had been caught 3 days earlier by a posse from Cheyenne. There had been a shootout, and Cole Drayton and 2 of his men had been killed. The others were in custody, awaiting trial. "You are safe now," Tobias said, squeezing Eleanor's hand. "Really safe? They cannot hurt you anymore." Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had not realized how much fear she had been carrying, fear that Cole Drayton would eventually track her down and take his revenge. Now that threat was gone forever. They went directly to the Silver Spur, where Hiram nearly fell over himself in shock and delight at seeing Eleanor. "Miss Hayes, you are back. I received your note, but I was so worried. And who is this?" He looked at Tobias with curiosity. "This is my husband, Tobias Kane," Eleanor said proudly. "We were married yesterday in Rapid City." Hiram's eyes went wide. "Married? Well, I will be damned. Congratulations." The news spread through Deadwood like wildfire. Some people were scandalized, whispering about the impropriety of Eleanor running off with a mountain man, but most were happy for her, especially those who remembered how Tobias had saved her from the Drayton gang. Eleanor resumed her position as the Silver Spurs singer, though now she only performed 3 nights a week. The other nights she spent at the cabin with Tobias, learning to navigate the balance between her 2 worlds, the civilized life of the town and the wild freedom of the mountains. Tobias proved to be remarkably adaptable. He still spent time in the mountains, tending to his traps and hunting, but he also began taking on work as a guide for miners and settlers heading into the Black Hills. His reputation as a man who could handle trouble made him much sought after, and the money was better than he had ever made trapping. They saved diligently, and within 6 months they had enough to purchase a small piece of land just outside Deadwood. Together, they built a proper house, not as large as some of the fancy homes in town, but solid and comfortable, with room to grow. Eleanor did not forget her dream of opening a music school. She began teaching singing lessons to children in Deadwood, charging modest rates that made lessons accessible to even the poorest mining families. She discovered she loved teaching, loved seeing young faces light up as they discovered the joy of music. Their first winter as a married couple was harsh, with heavy snows that sometimes left them snowed in for days at a time. But Eleanor found she did not mind. There was something cozy about being trapped in their small house with Tobias, keeping the fire burning, telling stories, making love under piles of warm blankets. In the spring, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complex mixture of joy and fear. She had lost her own mother to illness, had seen how dangerous childbirth could be on the frontier. But Tobias was overjoyed, his face transformed by a happiness she had never seen before. "We are going to have a family," he said wonderingly, his large hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "I never thought I would have this again." "Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," Tobias replied, pulling her into his arms. "You have given me back my life, Eleanor. You have given me everything." The pregnancy was not easy. Eleanor suffered from terrible morning sickness in the early months, and the summer heat made her miserable. But Tobias was endlessly patient and attentive, bringing her cool water, rubbing her swollen feet, building her a comfortable chair on their porch where she could sit and catch the breeze. She continued teaching and singing as long as she was able, finally stopping in her 7th month when the physical demands became too much. The women of Deadwood rallied around her, bringing food and baby clothes, offering advice and support. Eleanor had not realized how much she had become part of the community until now. In late November, as the first snows began to fall, Eleanor went into labor. Tobias had arranged for the town's midwife, a competent woman named Martha Henley, to attend the birth. He paced the small house like a caged bear while Eleanor labored, his face tight with worry. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours. Eleanor had never experienced such pain, such exhaustion. But every time she wanted to give up, she would hear Tobias's voice outside the room, asking if she was all right, and she would find the strength to continue. Finally, just after dawn, their son was born. He came into the world screaming lustily, his tiny fists waving, and Eleanor fell in love immediately. Martha cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft blankets before placing him in Eleanor's arms. "You have a healthy boy, Mrs. Kane. Congratulations." Tobias was allowed in then, and Eleanor saw tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, his large finger stroking the baby's tiny cheek with infinite gentleness. "He is perfect," Tobias whispered. "What should we name him?" Eleanor asked. Tobias was quiet for a moment. "Would you mind if we called him William? It was my father's name." "William Kane," Eleanor said, testing it out. "It is perfect. Hello, William. Welcome to the world." The baby yawned, and both parents laughed through their tears. Recovery from childbirth was slow, and Eleanor gained new appreciation for the strength of women everywhere who went through this ordeal. Tobias was an attentive father, learning to change diapers and soothe a crying baby with surprising skill. He would walk William around the house at night, singing lullabies in his deep, rumbling voice, and Eleanor would watch them with her heart full to bursting. When spring came, Eleanor gradually resumed teaching and performing. She had hired a young woman named Sarah, named for Tobias's first wife, with his blessing to help with the baby during her working hours. It was an arrangement that served everyone well. William grew quickly, becoming a sturdy, happy child with his father's green eyes and his mother's blonde hair. Tobias doted on him, taking him on gentle rides around the property, teaching him to identify animal tracks, reading to him from the few books they owned. 2 years after William's birth, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter they named Clara, after Eleanor's mother. This birth was easier than the first, and Clara proved to be a placid baby who slept through the night almost from the beginning. Their little family thrived. Eleanor's music school grew, eventually requiring her to hire 2 additional teachers to handle all the students. Tobias's guiding business was equally successful, and he had gained a reputation as the best guide in the Black Hills. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, with enough to provide for their children and save for the future. The years passed in a blur of happiness. William grew into a strong, confident boy who loved the mountains as much as his father. Clara proved to have inherited Eleanor's voice, and by the time she was 5, she was already singing in church and at local gatherings. In 1882, 6 years after their wedding, Eleanor gave birth to another son, whom they named Samuel. He completed their family, and Eleanor and Tobias decided 3 children were enough. Life was not without its challenges. The Dakota Territory was still a rough, sometimes dangerous place. There were occasional conflicts with Native American tribes who had been pushed off their lands by the influx of miners and settlers. Eleanor grieved for the injustices she witnessed, the broken treaties, and casual cruelty toward people who had lived in these mountains long before the white man arrived. She and Tobias taught their children to respect all people, regardless of the color of their skin. Deadwood itself evolved from a rough mining camp into a more established town. Streets were graded and improved, schools and churches were built, law enforcement became more effective. The wild, lawless days of the town's founding began to fade into legend. Through it all, Eleanor and Tobias's love only deepened. They had built something real and lasting, a family, a home, a community. On quiet evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch their children play, marveling at the unlikely path that had brought them together. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked one such evening. "Giving up your solitary life in the mountains?" Tobias pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Not for a single moment. You gave me back my life, Eleanor. You gave me everything I had lost and more than I ever dreamed of having." "You saved me first," Eleanor reminded him, "from the Drayton gang, from a life of fear and loneliness." "Then I suppose we saved each other," Tobias said with a smile. Eleanor thought back to that night in the Silver Spur, when she had stood frozen in the center of the room, terrified and alone. She thought about the moment the door had exploded inward and Tobias had appeared like an avenging angel. She thought about the shot that had silenced the piano and the terrifying quiet that had followed. That moment had changed everything, had set in motion a chain of events that led to this, to a home filled with love and laughter, to children running through the house, to a partnership that had survived every challenge the frontier could throw at them. "I love you," Eleanor said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them. "I love you too," Tobias replied. "Always." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Eleanor leaned against her husband and felt contentment settle over her like a warm blanket. She had come to the Dakota Territory with nothing, fleeing desperation and poverty. She had found instead a life richer than any she could have imagined. The years continued to pass. William grew into a young man who combined his father's strength with his mother's gentleness. He decided to become a lawman, wanting to protect people the way his father had once done. Tobias was proud, though Eleanor worried about the dangers of such a profession. Clara's voice only grew more beautiful as she matured, and by the time she was 16, she was performing not just in Deadwood, but in cities throughout the territory. Eleanor traveled with her sometimes, playing the role of chaperone and teacher, delighting in watching her daughter share the gift of music with others. Samuel proved to have a head for business. He helped manage Eleanor's music school, implementing new systems and expanding their reach. By the time he was 20, he had transformed the small operation into a thriving academy with branches in 3 towns. In 1891, the Dakota Territory was divided into 2 states, North Dakota and South Dakota. Deadwood found itself part of the new state of South Dakota, and there were great celebrations as the frontier officially became part of the United States proper. Eleanor and Tobias were now in their late 30s, no longer young but far from old. They had weathered 15 years of marriage, raised 3 children, built a successful business, and established themselves as respected members of their community. But their love for each other had not dimmed. If anything, it had grown stronger, tempered by shared experience and deepened by mutual respect. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Tobias surprised Eleanor by taking her back to the cabin where they had spent those early weeks together. He had maintained it over the years, using it as a base camp for his guiding trips, and it looked much the same as it had when Eleanor first saw it. "I wanted to bring you back here," Tobias said as they stood on the porch, looking out at the familiar view, "to remember where we began." "We have come so far," Eleanor marveled. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it." "I can believe it," Tobias said, "because I have been there for every moment, every challenge, every triumph, every ordinary day, and I would not trade a single one of them." They spent the weekend at the cabin, just the 2 of them, reliving old memories and creating new ones. It was a precious gift, this time alone together, and they savored every moment. As they prepared to return to Deadwood, Eleanor took one last look at the cabin. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said, "for reminding me of where we started." "We started with you needing to be saved," Tobias said. "We have come a long way from that frightened woman in the saloon." "You are right," Eleanor agreed. "I am not that woman anymore, but I am grateful to her, because her fear and her desperation led her to you." They rode back to Deadwood together, their horses side by side, just as they had been on that first journey 15 years earlier. But everything was different now. They were not running from danger, but returning home. They had children waiting for them, students who needed Eleanor's guidance, clients who depended on Tobias's expertise. They had built a life together from nothing, had turned fear into courage, loneliness into love, and uncertainty into confidence. The years that followed were good ones. William did become a lawman, serving as a deputy marshal in Rapid City. He married a teacher named Elizabeth, and they gave Eleanor and Tobias their first grandchild, a baby girl named Eleanor after her grandmother. Clara continued her singing career, eventually moving to Denver, where she performed in legitimate theaters and opera houses. She married a banker named Charles, who adored her and supported her career. They had 3 children, all musically talented. Samuel married his childhood sweetheart, a woman named Margaret who shared his business acumen. Together they expanded the music academy even further, eventually opening locations throughout the region. Eleanor and Tobias became grandparents many times over, their home frequently filled with the laughter of grandchildren. They grew older together, silver creeping into their hair, lines deepening around their eyes. But their love remained constant, as strong and true as it had been on that night when Tobias had burst into the Silver Spur and changed both their lives forever. On a warm evening in June of 1901, 25 years after they first met, Eleanor and Tobias sat on their porch watching yet another sunset. Their grandchildren were running through the yard, playing some elaborate game that involved a great deal of shouting and laughter. "We have been blessed," Eleanor said softly. "More than blessed," Tobias agreed. "We have been given a miracle." Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought them here, the pain and loss that had shaped them both, the fear that had nearly broken her, the violence that had nearly claimed Tobias's life multiple times. All of it had led to this moment, to this place, to this family they had created together. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. "In the saloon?" "Of course. I think about it often." Tobias took her hand, his touch as familiar as her own heartbeat. "I think about how close I came to riding right past. I was tired, wanted to get back to my camp. If that piano had not been so loud. But it was loud, and you came, and you shot the piano and made everything go quiet. And I saw you," Tobias finished, "standing there so brave, so determined not to give those men what they wanted. And I knew in that moment that you were someone worth fighting for." "I was terrified," Eleanor confessed, "but I was also angry. I had already lost so much. I was not going to lose my dignity too." "You never did," Tobias said. "You have always held your head high, no matter what came. That is one of the things I love most about you." Eleanor smiled. "One of the things? What are the others?" "Your voice, your kindness, your strength, the way you love our children, the way you love me, even when I do not deserve it." He squeezed her hand. "I could go on all night?" "Please do not," Eleanor teased. "We need to get these children fed and to bed eventually." But she was deeply moved by his words, as she always was when Tobias expressed his feelings. He had come so far from the closed-off, grieving man she had first met. He smiled easily now, laughed often, and did not flinch away from expressing love. As the stars began to appear overhead, Eleanor reflected on the unlikely path her life had taken. She had come to the Dakota Territory expecting nothing more than survival. Instead, she had found purpose, family, and a love that had sustained her through 25 years of marriage and would sustain her for however many years remained. The grandchildren were finally rounded up and taken inside for dinner. Eleanor and Tobias remained on the porch a moment longer, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Happy?" Tobias asked. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," Eleanor replied, echoing the words he had spoken to her so many years ago. "Then I have done my job," Tobias said with satisfaction. "Your job? Making sure you are happy. That has been my job since the moment I met you, and I plan to continue until my last breath." Eleanor leaned against his solid shoulder, feeling his strength and warmth. "In that case, you have been remarkably successful." They sat together in the darkness, two people who had found each other against all odds in a wild, unforgiving land. They had built something beautiful from broken pieces, had created love from loneliness, and had raised a family that would carry their legacy forward. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of approaching rain. Inside the house, voices called for them, summoning them to dinner and family and the ordinary miracles of everyday life. But for one more moment, Eleanor and Tobias stayed where they were, holding each other in the darkness, grateful for every twist of fate that had brought them together. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the danger they had faced or the challenges they had overcome, but the quiet joy of sitting beside someone you loved, knowing they loved you back just as fiercely, knowing that whatever came next, you would face it together. Eleanor and Tobias stood finally, hand in hand, and walked into their home, into the warmth and light and love they had created, into the life they had built together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, for 25 years and counting. Their story had begun with violence and fear, with a gunshot that silenced a piano and made a room go quiet. But it had evolved into something beautiful, a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of courage and connection and commitment. And it was far from over. Eleanor and Tobias had many years ahead of them still, years filled with more grandchildren, more challenges, more moments of quiet joy. They would grow old together, would eventually pass on, leaving behind children and grandchildren who would tell stories about the mountain man who saved a singer from outlaws and the brave woman who saved him right back. But all of that was still to come. For now, on this perfect evening in June 1901, they were simply two people in love, surrounded by family, grateful for every blessing they had received. The door closed behind them, shutting out the night. Inside, their family waited, ready to share a meal and make new memories. And Eleanor and Tobias Kane, former strangers who had become soulmates, stepped into that warmth together, ready for whatever the future would bring. Because they had learned the most important lesson the frontier had to teach, that love, real and true and hard, won, could survive anything, could transform tragedy into triumph, fear into courage, and loneliness into belonging. That lesson had shaped their lives, had guided them through every trial, and would continue to light their way forward for all the years to come. And as they sat down to dinner surrounded by the people they loved most in the world, Eleanor caught Tobias's eye across the table and smiled. He smiled back, his green eyes warm with love and contentment. And in that moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Their story, which had begun with such violence and fear, had become a love story for the ages. A story that would be told and retold by their descendants, growing richer with each telling. The story of how a mountain man saved a singer, and how together they built a life that defied all expectations. It was a story about courage and redemption, about second chances and the transformative power of love. It was a story about two broken people who found wholeness in each other, who created something beautiful from the raw materials of pain and loss. But most importantly, it was their story, uniquely theirs, shaped by their choices and their commitment to each other. And as Eleanor looked around the table at the faces of her children and grandchildren, she knew that their story would continue long after she and Tobias were gone. The legacy they left would not be measured in gold or property or accomplishments, though they had plenty of all three. It would be measured in the love they had shared, the example they had set, and the family they had created. And that, Eleanor thought with deep satisfaction, was the best legacy of all. The evening wore on, filled with laughter and conversation and the comfortable chaos of a large family gathering. Eleanor felt Tobias's hand find hers under the table, his fingers lacing through hers with the ease of long practice. She squeezed back, a silent communication that needed no words. "Thank you," that squeeze said, "for everything, for saving me, for loving me, for building this life with me." And Tobias's answering squeeze said, "Thank you back, for giving me a reason to live again, for showing me that love can come twice in a lifetime, for being my partner, my love, my everything." They had said these things to each other 1,000 times over the years, in words and in actions, but they never tired of saying them again. Because that was what love was, a constant choice, a continual recommitment, a daily decision to cherish and honor and protect the person you had chosen to share your life with. Eleanor and Tobias had made that choice 25 years ago, on the day they married in a small church in Rapid City. They had remade that choice every day since, through good times and bad, through prosperity and hardship, through joy and sorrow. And they would continue making that choice for all the years they had left, because they had learned that love was not just a feeling but an action, not just passion but partnership, not just romance but respect. They had learned that love was work, sometimes hard work, but always worthwhile work. And they had learned that the rewards of that work, the deep contentment, the abiding joy, the sense of being truly known and truly cherished, were worth every effort. As the dinner finally ended and the grandchildren were collected by their parents and taken home, Eleanor and Tobias found themselves alone in their house once more. They moved through the familiar ritual of cleaning up, working side by side with the efficiency of long practice. When everything was put away and the house was quiet, they stood together at the window, looking out at the night. The mountains rose dark against the star-studded sky, eternal and unchanging. But everything else had changed. The wild frontier had been tamed, the lawless mining camp had become a thriving town, and two lonely, broken people had become a family. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. For what? For everything. For that night in the saloon. For all the nights since. For giving me a life I could never have imagined. Tobias turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. You gave me that life too. We made it together. Together, Eleanor agreed. I like that word. So do I. Tobias kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then finally her lips. Come to bed, my love. Tomorrow will come soon enough, and I want to spend tonight holding you. Eleanor smiled. That sounds perfect. They climbed the stairs to their bedroom, leaving the worries and wonders of the world behind. In the privacy of their room, they prepared for bed with the comfortable intimacy of long-married couples. And when they finally lay down together, Eleanor rested her head on Tobias's broad chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. This, she thought, this is what matters. This moment, this man, this love. Everything else is just details. I love you, she whispered into the darkness. I love you too, Tobias murmured back, his arms tightening around her, now and always. They drifted off to sleep together, wrapped in each other's arms, secure in their love and their commitment to each other. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the mountains stood watch over the town of Deadwood and all who dwelt there. The story that had begun with a gunshot and a moment of terrifying silence had become a love story for the ages. And though Eleanor and Tobias did not know it, their story would be told and retold for generations to come, inspiring others to have courage in the face of fear, to take chances on love, and to believe that even in the darkest moments, hope could prevail. But all of that was still in the future, for now on this perfect night, they were simply two people in love, grateful for every moment they had been given, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Together. Always together. And that was the happiest ending of all.